So let's start by talking about some of the key factory method operators defined in the Flux class. There'll be a bunch of factory methods we're going to talk about. These are some of the more basic ones that you'll need to know. There's more powerful ones we'll talk about later. So what are factory methods? Hopefully you remember your Gang of Four book. But factory methods are basically methods that create stuff. They separate the creation process or the creation logic from the thing that is created. I'd use examples like sausage making and legislation, where you often don't want to know how they're made. You just want to have the results of what makes them. So we're going to talk about just, fromArray, fromIterable, and from, which are four of the more basic factory methods in Flux. So let's talk about the just operator. Just creates a flux that emits the given element, or elements, because you can have multiple of them, and then completes. So you can see that it takes a var_arg parameter, which just means you can have a bunch of these things. It's basically a list. And those are the elements that we want the flux to emit. And what it does is it returns a flux that's captured at assembly time. In other words, it's eager. It's like a puppy that always wants to play with you when you want to play. And the term assembly time is kind of a funny term because it sounds like it's assembly code, nothing to do with assembly code. It just means when the Flux object is instantiated versus when it actually runs. So that's what it means to be eager. So it's when it's created. And that'll typically be done in a particular thread. When it runs, it might be in a different thread. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about lazy factory methods. As you can see, multiple elements can be emitted based on what you put in the var_args parameter list, unlike Mono's just operator. We haven't talked a lot about Mono, but as you might imagine, Mono has only one thing that emits. So Mono's just will just emit one versus Flux's just, which can emit many. Pretty straightforward. This factory method operator, like all the factory method operators we're going to talk about, is used to, or many of the factory method operators we're going to talk about, is used to adapt non-reactive input sources into the reactive model. So here you can see we want to create a Flux stream of 4 big fraction operators, or objects. So here are 4 big fractions. Those are not reactive. We want to make a reactive object a Flux, so we use just to make us a Flux with 4 of these things in it. Since just is evaluated eagerly at assembly time, it runs in the thread where the assembly is performed. So for example, over here, whatever thread we happen to be calling just in here, that is the thread where we will create this Flux. You'll also see when we get to them in a second, fromIterable and fromArray are also factory method operators that are evaluated eagerly. There's one that is not, called from, and we'll talk about that in just a moment too. RxJava has a just method on its observable and flowable that works just like Fluxes do. Interestingly enough, and for completeness, streams also contains a factory method called of, which is like just in that it takes a bunch of objects and turns them into a stream. They don't turn them into a reactive stream, they just turn them into a stream, but very much the same kind of idea. Let's talk about fromIterable. This creates a Flux that emits the items that are contained in the given iterable passed as the one and only parameter. So here's the iterable. Remember, iterable is an interface that things like lists and sets implement. And a little trivia, the iterable iterator method will be invoked at least once and at most twice for each subscriber. This can be a little surprising. I just mentioned it because it burned me a couple times, so I'm just going to put them in here. Most of the time, you don't really care about them. This factory method, like just, also adapts non-reactive input into the reactive model. And it typically works with Java collections like lists and sets. So here's a very simple example. We have a list of integers, which contain duplicates. And here we create a Flux stream of integer objects from the Java list collection. Pretty straightforward. RxJava has a fromIterable that works exactly the same way. And Java Streams has the stream method, stream operation, that will go ahead and take a list and turn it into a stream. So similar kind of idea in all the different paradigms we've talked about thus far. The next method is called fromArray. Surprise, surprise, it creates a flux that will emit the items in the built-in array that's passed as a parameter. That's what it looks like. That's the syntax. It returns a flux that emits the items in the array. Also, really no surprise there. Here's a very simple example. We have an integer array, and we make a flux that will emit the items in that array. Lo and behold, RxJava has something identical to that. And Java Streams also has something similar, where you have the stream_of method that takes an array and turns it into a stream. There's other ways of doing this. You can either do stream_of or do arrays.stream. Both of those turn arrays into streams. The fourth and final intro factory method we're going to talk about, factory method operator in the Flux class is the from method. And we'll see it's a little different. And what it's going to do is it's going to take some source and it's going to turn that source into a flux. And the parameter that's provided is the source that we want turned into a flux. And this is a lot more powerful than what we've seen so far. So this thing can be any publisher at all. The flux that's returned here decorates the source at runtime rather than assembly time. So in other words, it's lazy. So if you recall before, we had the puppy that always wants to play with you. Now we have a cat that wants to spend most of its time napping, and usually until food is ready to be, until it hears the food dish being opened. This factory method operator, again, adapts non-Flux publishers into the Flux API. And it could also be Flux publishers, but it's usually non-Flux publishers. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to, for example, create a Flux that contains a single big fraction object that's going to be emitted from a mono. So what the heck's going on here? So we're using Flux.from to lazily create a single big fraction. And from is lazy. And so what does it mean for from to be lazy? It means that what it does is it takes this parameter and it stores it as basically a lambda expression. And it will invoke this parameter at the time of the subscription. That is, when someone subscribes, when a subscriber subscribes to this particular factory method, that's when this Mono.fromCallable blah blah gets called. Not at assembly time, it's at runtime when it actually runs. And each time a different subscriber subscribes, you'll get a different result. And I intentionally set this one up to demonstrate the case where we're making a random big fraction. So each time this thing gets called dynamically, every time it subscribes, you'll get a different value back. Again, underscoring the fact that the Mono.fromCallable blah 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 is taking place dynamically at runtime. This from feature can be used to work around the fact that Flux lacks a fromCallable method. So RxJava has a fromCallable method on an observable or a flowable that works in this dynamically bound runtime enabled versus assembly time enabled fashion. For some reason, Flux doesn't have that, and this is a way to work around that absence. Once again, good luck trying to find the reason for this on the web anywhere. I asked ChatGPT about this, and we engaged in a little dialogue, and I put that here. I'll fix this formatting later. But if you click on this link, it'll explain to you why Flux does not have a fromCallable and how you can use Mono.fromCallable in conjunction with Flux.from to approximate the behavior of RxJava's fromCallable semantics. As you can see, RxJava has a fromCallable method that's similar. They don't have that in Flux, but you can do it easily with observable. I like the observable fromCallable. It's a very nice abstraction. And you can see it's a little bit simpler. This is a bit more convoluted with Flux.from, but fromCallable works very nicely. So that's the end of the discussion of the first round of factory method operators in the Flux class.